Like that was like my heart's desire, is to renounce shoes. And if anyone knew me a long time ago, you'll know I only wore one pair of shoes 365 days a year, secretly, to fulfill this desire, because apparently I was married and couldn't become a hermit like I wanted to. But I had this like burning desire in my heart to like do something radical for Jesus. And to me, that meant going in the woods by myself and stepping on thorns, I guess. That's what I wanted to do. And I got to a point in my life where I was really restless. I had all these kids and all these diapers and this husband, and I just kind of felt like I missed my calling. Like, oh, well, apparently I'm stuck now. And I mean, I had a great life. I don't want to make it sound like I didn't, because I had every dream. I got to stay home with my kids, and I had healthy children, and a husband who loved me. But there was just this like kind of restlessness in me. And then thankfully I found St. Therese's little way and learned that even in ordinary mundane tasks of daily life of being a mother, I could be radical. So when I would wash dishes, I would wash those dishes super good. And I would say, for the love of you, Jesus. And when I would wash the third set of pea sheets for the day, for you, Jesus. And like, I felt some comfort in that. Like, okay, well, I'm not in the woods, I'm not a hermit, but at least I can like do these little hidden things that only he knows about. And that really comforted my heart. So I became comfortable in my life, and I came to my marriage with a lot of trauma in my past. So even my relationship with my husband was kind of difficult, like with intimacy and everything. But we kind of found our way and found our groove, and I kind of became content. And then our fourth child was born. I don't really, let's see, oh, it worked. His name is Dominic. This is a private picture that I don't show people. But when I was praying about what to say to you guys, the only word I kept hearing was everything. I was like, really? Everything? Yes, everything. So now Jesus not only let me be a hermit, he put me naked in the desert. So we didn't know anything was going on with Dominic until he came out. This is just my post, laboring for so many hours. We get the baby picture that somebody took, thankfully. And so I was kind of like a hermit. Saint Catherine Doherty, she's not a saint, she's a servant of God, Catherine Doherty. And I'm going to butcher her names because no one's ever told them to me, #dyslexic, and so I've only read them, and so I know I'm not saying it right. But she's a servant of God, and she describes her hermit as a postina, is anybody? It's just basically a fancy, different way to say hermitage. And I found myself in my own postina, but only years later would realize that's what Jesus did. Like he granted my heart's desire that I had kind of forgotten about. And my postina was the hospital room, where I was alone. So Jesus allowed these little small wounds to start coming onto my heart, preparing me. I love the image of the scourged Jesus, because I think it's the most beautiful at that point. He's the most beautiful at that point. He has nothing left to give, and he was getting me ready to meet his mother, which at the time I didn't know Our Lady. And some of his little scourges that he allowed me to have. About 3 hours after Dominic was born, the doctor told us that it might be best to let him go home and die peacefully. At this point, he could breathe. So I was like, I'm not sure how that's supposed to happen. But I'm thankful for that doctor, because that doctor taught me that I'm going to have to fight. And without that doctor, I may not have learned that. The stab of the nurse with the star tattoo who described his fingers. Oh, that's him right after birth on the side. Who described his fingers as, quote, jacked up. I was sitting by his little incubator before the time of iPhones, and just being super bored because I sat there all day. I mean, looking at the baby, not. But there was a chart, I picked it up, there was a list of features that right after birth somebody jotted down. Jacked up fingers was the last thing that was written. I hated that woman for a long time, but now I love that woman, because that woman is the one who taught me that Dominic looked like the scourged Jesus. and helped me to love this coach Jesus so much. She's the one who showed me what the world would see Jesus as. That he would be ridiculed and rejected. She's the one that taught me to proclaim his beauty in this world, who only values ability, what you can do, how hard you can work, what you can provide everyone else. And Dominic was a stark contrast to that. He couldn't do anything. He was born deaf, blind, and dumb in the biblical sense. And so I love her now. The stab in my heart when the lactation consultant would come every 3 hours, you know, they hold your breast and they put the baby on it, and Dominic would just sit there. He wasn't born with the reflex to suck like a normal baby. And then the look in her eye, and she would apologetically say, we'll try again in 3 hours, and come back in the same thing. And then eventually said, I think he'll be a candidate for comfort nursing, which means that he would just sit there on the breast and not be able to do anything. We both decided that was a little awkward for both of us, so we both decided not to do it. I remember being in the room, another little stab that Jesus allowed me to have, being in the room with the radiology doctor and finding out that all his insides were flipped and upside down. So everything about him wasn't born right. And then before this, because I was a super good mother, I would drive to 3 different farms every single week. I would buy only raw milk for my children because I love them. I purged my house of plastic, only organically, locally grown meat and vegetables. And while this in itself is not bad, this is actually very good. For me, it became my golden calf. This is how I proved that I love my children more, is because I don't let them have vegetables. And so now I find myself, this little baby, pumping my milk into a plastic bottle, being fed through a plastic tube, into a plastic button in his stomach. Like the most unnatural thing you could possibly imagine, to do the most normal thing, which is eating. And I'm so grateful Jesus allowed me those humiliations I call them humiliations because they help me to grow in humility, to really like shake me, be like, you worship me. You don't worship all this other stuff that you keep putting on this high pedestal. And then the last one I want to tell you about is we were in the surgery waiting room. We thought that maybe he would need a trach. And the doctor walked in after doing the test, and the whole family was in there, you know, all my extended family. She came in and she said, he looks great, he doesn't need a trach. And my whole family jumped up and they laughed and they hugged and they congratulated each other because, okay, we don't need that to breathe. And I remember sitting there in that like 10-mile stare, knowing it wasn't true, and knowing that he would need that. At the moment he didn't, but there was something in me that knew, that mother's intuition. And I remember at that point, like for the first time, really being able to unite myself with Jesus and being like, yes. And that's my prayer that I was able to say through his 8 years of life. I wasn't able to say a lot of words, but yes was my only prayer. At this point, we were pretty low, and after the trach, we were sitting in the ICU room. He was recovering, totally sedated because he had a fresh trach, so they sedate him for a while to let the hole heal. A trach goes in your trachea to breathe. And I remember just sitting there and feeling so sorry for myself, like, poor me? Why do I have to be in the hospital? Why do we have to have a disabled kid? You know, and just like everything was about me, and then poor him, why does he have to go through this? How am I gonna have to carry all this equipment? And my husband was standing at the incubator, and I'll never, until I die, forget this moment. Even in like complete sedation, Dominic put himself in this position that later in his life he would always put himself in times of the most difficulty and most pain. He was just, how old was he? I don't know, 8 weeks old there. and he would put himself in a cruciform position. And this is, our first very cell phones that came out with cameras, and so this was like a grainy cell phone picture of that moment when that happened. And at that point, I don't know how it works. I hope one day to join him in heaven and be able to ask and find out, but I feel like somehow, in some way, he must have given his consent to be a suffering soul. Because he had a good life. He had a good life. He had so many happy times, but he suffered a lot. And this was always our reminder that to unite ourselves with Jesus, and that snapped me right out of feeling sorry for myself, and right into uniting myself with Jesus' cross. So God desires us. God desires you, all of you women. He asks us for our yes in all circumstances. It's easy to say yes when things are going well. For me, this looked like going to therapy 9 times a week, and going to doctor's visits a couple times a week, and tube feeding, and having nurses in the house, and never being able to take my bra off because there was someone else who didn't have there in my house. And it sounds silly, but this was like a big deal. I just want to take my bra off, but I can't because there's a nurse. Or sitting at the kitchen table having an argument with my husband, and the nurse walks in, who we love. His first nurse, she was there the day he died. She stayed with him his whole life. And she walks in singing her African hymns, just doing dishes like we're not in the middle of a fight. I'm like, can we have a fight in our own house, please? No, we couldn't. So we would sit there quietly, wait for her to finish, leave, and then we start fighting again. So for me, that's what this yes looked like. And thanking God for the brokenness. Thanking God, and embracing the daily routine and the struggle that we all have, and everybody looks different in that, but thanking God. Thank you, Lord, that he's deaf. Thank you, Jesus, that he's blind. Thank you that he's lame. And I purposely use those words to help me to remember the scripture passages. And there really is beauty in the mess of life. So some of you guys just have little babies, some of you guys have grandkids, some of you guys have teenagers. By far the hardest. In that right now. But in the darkness is where you can intimately encounter Jesus. Just like at night, for those married people, when you're in bed with your husband and the lights are off, and there's silence because you're both trying to go to sleep, in that kind of whispering intimacy. Jesus encounters us there. He invites us to lay our head on his chest and to be known and to be loved. We don't have to give him anything. He just wants to love us. And so it's in that darkness that's so beautiful. Now, I told you when I was praying about this that I asked what you needed to hear. And I kept hearing everything. And I thought, but not this. It's Easter. And then I heard everything. So I'm going to tell you about the first day of my life. And it's not the day that he died. So we, at this point, had been in the hospital for a couple weeks. This was his last admission. And we had already had a couple surgeries. Did not have a smooth stay that time. Actually, someone in the room here was in there with me. And he was, luckily when he would get in intense pain, he would pass out. And so that's how we knew something bad was going on, is he would pass out and everything was fine. He just would pass out as like a protective measure. But he didn't pass out this time. And this is the time that I felt closest, that I could, I pray the Stations of the Cross and the Rosary. I can't really get it. It's really hard for me to be there and to meditate. And this is the one time that I felt like I was on the path watching Jesus, as he drags his cross by and just has an ounce of life left in him. And I was standing at the head of the bed, and Dominic was just screaming, wailing, this crazed look in his eyes because the pain was so intense he couldn't take it. We were on the regular hospital floor, so we were getting the biggest medicine you could get on the regular floor, which for him was like Tylenol. Because he had a life of chronic pain, he had so much pain medicine that he had a tolerance for it. And so regular pain medicine wouldn't touch it. Even morphine, it literally wouldn't do anything. And it had been like this for a couple days, and it was so intense. And I just, I stood at the head of the bed and I cradled his head like I always did and sang to him and prayed and just was really able to unite his suffering to Jesus, like, even this, yes. Even this, like, most horrible thing, yes. And there was a shift change and a new hospitalist came on board. In his 8 years of his life, he never had a hospitalist. Hospitalist is a doctor who's kind of in charge of the general population of the hospital. So they're not the surgeon or the orthopedic doctor or the lung doctor. They're just kind of the general doctor. We've never had a general doctor because he's too specialized. And somehow, this admission, we got a general doctor. And this is why, because when the shift change came and that doctor walked in, she was really concerned, and about 3 minutes later, we were flooded. There was, so many people. I had to leave the bedside at one point because of all the nurses. And we've been in a lot of emergencies. I've resuscitated him multiple times. But this was different. This intensity was different. So a few minutes later, we were in the ICU. Again, flooded with people. He was able to get the medicine he needed to calm down. It was only available in the ICU. And that shift changed that night. I'll never forget this man's face. I don't know his name, but our nurse that night, nurses aren't rattled. Nurses will resuscitate a kid, they'll die, and then they go to the next kid. This is just the way that ICU nurses work, and this is their job, and they're very good at it. But I'll never forget, this nurse pulled up his computer. We were one-on-one, which is like one nurse per one patient. It's the highest ratio you can have in the hospital. He pulled up his little computer, rolling computer, and he had contact with Dominic's bed or body the entire 12-hour shift. Every time I looked at him, he was either touching Dominic or his knee was on the bed. He knew he was dying. He just didn't want it to happen on his shift. So that night, in the wee morning hours, when I would go to sleep in the hospital, I had a whole routine, right? So I'd put on my sweats from college, because those are super comfy, and my hoodie, and I'd pull it up over my head and squeeze the string real tight, so all you can see was this. Because we are in a curtained room, there's no walls, and so you can hear everything. You can hear all the babies crying, and all the machines, and so you couldn't sleep. So this is how I would do it, and I'd curl up on the little couch made of vinyl, and I remember laying there, and just the coldness seeping through, and then I just had this agony that I've never felt before. And I had to get out of there. I didn't have a bra at this point, so I didn't even care. And I was down in the hospital lobby, and it was like 3 a.m. It was totally empty. There's these little couches outside of the cafeteria at the hospital, and I remember just being pressed against the corner of this vinyl couch, my knees up to my chest, sobbing. I feel like I handle emergencies really well. I'm actually more comfortable in emergencies than I am right now. But just sobbing and knowing this is it. I have fought for 8 years and kept him alive, and I can't fight my way through this. This is the end. He's dying. And there's 2 places we can be when we were admitted in the hospital, the ICU or the vent floor. Because he had a ventilator, he couldn't go anywhere else. And so I knew these people in the vent floor really well because we were there a lot. And so somehow I found myself up there, shoeless and braless, standing in front of the nurse's station, just blank-faced, and the nurse manager, whom I really loved, came and got me, and everyone knew, we went from that floor to the ICU. Everyone knew it was time, he was dying, and the other nurses came in and held me, and we cried. It was beautiful, and somehow I ended up back in his ICU room and passed out. I don't remember, not literally, but fell asleep. And the next thing I remember is the surgeon waking me up saying, we're going to emergency surgery. This was a random picture. I forgot what I was going to say for that. So this was kind of a norm for us with when we would go in for emergencies, and I love this picture, so I wanted to share it with you. So so he actually started to stabilize and do better. He couldn't eat, so he was on nutrition that he would get through his through like a port in his chest, actually. But he was doing okay. Okay. He wasn't doing okay. He was in the ICU. What I'm saying is he wasn't about to die at that point. And the pulmonologist came in one day, and I said, I love this woman. She has fought for him his whole life and really has seen his dignity. And I said, I want to spend our last Christmas at home, because she also knew he was dying. And she said, we don't send kids this sick home. And I said, I need to spend our last Christmas at home. And so she just kind of smiled and nodded and left. And she moved mountains. to get everything we needed to do, to get the permissions, so we discharged right from the ICU home to hospice. So he was at home, we had a beautiful Christmas, and then the time came where he made his intentions clear that he was ready to go. He rejected the ventilator, like he wouldn't. The ventilator breathes for you, but when it's time for people to die, they'll reject it and they fight it. So he did all of that. So we brought everybody in who might want to say goodbye and who he might want to say goodbye to. He was in a coma at this point, but everybody got to come say goodbye. And we had read that people like to say their goodbyes before they go. And so everyone we could think of, we brought in. And he just remained. And so he is a spiritual father, who's also my spiritual father. And he was in China at the time, and so I got a hold of him and I said, I need you to get permission, like he's waiting to see you. Come, because you're in China. So I put him on speakerphone, and he told him it's okay to go. But he remained. And we couldn't quite figure out why. And because he was ready, he was right there on the brink for a full week. And then I read, well, sometimes people don't like to have people in the room. So then when we had periods of time where we would leave him alone, like imagine that, and actually one day we sat on the porch drinking a beer while our kid was literally dying, because we're like, he just needs to be alone, and so we're gonna give him that time. And that was an anxious beer. And wondering like, has it happened? And so we went back into the room, no, he was still there. And we couldn't figure out like, what are you holding on for? Like you should have died like a week ago. And so that Sunday was Divine Mercy Sunday, and a friend brought us the Eucharist. And so we woke all the kids up. They all came to our room, very sleepy. We all received Jesus, and everyone was sitting on my bed. It was just really a beautiful, peaceful time. And 15 minutes after Jesus came into our house, Dominic took 3 last breaths and he died. And I sat there on the corner of my bed. I can't look at your faces. I sat there on the corner of my bed where he was conceived, and seeing the shadow of death on his face. It's such a beautiful and holy death. This is the death. I think we don't understand when we pray for a good death, what it means. This is a good death. He was waiting for Jesus all this time. We brought everyone we could think of, but I didn't think of Jesus. So he was waiting for him, and I'm no theologian. I don't know how long Jesus stays in your system after you receive the Eucharist, but I've heard it's about that amount of time. So he was waiting for him, and then he went home. And that's all we can ask for. I skipped this picture because I'm just talking to you. I'm sorry. This is his last hospital stay. This is his cruciform picture again. At midnight last night, this was all in order. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. This is his last day whenever we knew he was dying. And that same cross that he would always hold. Here's his last Christmas at home. He was awake. He was on all of the nutrition that would go directly to his aorta. He had an ileostomy bag at that point because he lost his gut had shut down, so he lost his function to use the bathroom. He was awake, and it was great. And he had a good life. Like, he had a fun life. Yeah, we had lots of times of pain and emergencies and all that, but he had a good life. And so I felt like I should put this in there to let you, well, I'll put that in a minute. So I really wish I could tell you that this beautiful, holy death just awakened the desire to be barefoot in the forest again. But the truth is it led to what I call my queso and twilight years. Because for about 2 years, I laid on the couch and I ate queso from Torchy's and watched Twilight to make me be about vampires. So I went from like, yes, Jesus, even this, yes, that's what I was supposed to say that. In the moment he died, he was taking his last 3 breaths, and my final fiat, even this, yes, like, even this, I have nothing left to give. And then I laid on the couch for 2 years and ate queso. My kindergartner had to drop out of school because of trauma. We went into huge amounts of debt because I wasn't functional. I gained a bunch of weight, obviously, from the queso. We all went to counseling. But the biggest thing is that God was kind of a jerk. And I was like, I gave you everything. In my darkest moment, I said yes to you, and this is what you do? What a jerk. And then I got to the point where I didn't really feel anything for God. You know, in Alice in Wonderland, when she's like falling down the rabbit hole, and eventually you just kind of forget you're falling? Like, that's how I felt. I couldn't feel gravity. I didn't know up or down. I couldn't even feel like I was falling anymore. It was like a void. I couldn't feel anything. I wasn't mad at God. I knew he abandoned me, but I didn't really blame him. I would have abandoned me too. I knew I was alone. I knew my marriage was probably going to fail. My kids were going to end up homeless drug addicts. Because apparently teenagers deal with grief different than we do. They don't lay on the couch and eat queso. They do risky behavior. Anyway, I made myself get up off the couch after 2 years and go get a job. And every day that I worked, I just fought through depression to get up the next day and go to work. And then this past March 10th, actually, I think there was a reading about Moses striking the rock. Is that right? If I'm wrong, just don't tell me, because I don't even want to know. But my heart was struck, and I was standing in the shower, and for the first time in 3 years, I prayed. I wasn't able to pray for 3 full years. And I just sat in the shower and prayed. And I was like, I'm praying. I can't believe I can pray. Because I tried to pray and I couldn't. And I was talking to my spiritual father about this and telling him how I was just so abandoned and God withdrew himself from me. And he said, you know, that feeling of not knowing where you are, that's also the feeling in the womb. And that you weren't falling, you were in the womb. And the womb is the safest place that a baby can be. They don't have to do anything. They don't have to earn their keep or work for their food or do something great to be loved. They're loved because they exist. And so those 3 years that I was having my queso and twilight days, I was just existing, and he loved me for existing. And it's just really beautiful. You know, sometime in Dominic's life, I met Our Lady and fell in love with her and consecrated myself to her. And so I feel like these 3 years, she kind of took her baby back, me, and figuratively held me in her womb. And it was like, this is the time we need. It was the day Cassie Martinez died, and I think it was a gift from her intercession. So, this isn't just a story of heartbreak and sadness and pain. Happy Easter! This, hopefully, is a story of encouragement and hope. Not hope that the world gives us that it's going to be better tomorrow, but hope in the eternal sense, that we have hope because of Jesus. We have hope because we're his daughters, we're daughters of the King, and we are not abandoned. And in our dark times, we need to fight. We need to fight like hell, okay? But in that same breath, we need to say, even this, yes. When your husband is still struggling with that same damn addiction you've been dealing with for 15 years, fight like hell for him, even this, yes. When your baby gets sick, even this, yes. You know? When you're just doing mundane stuff and homeschooling your children or washing dishes or dealing with so much pee and poop you can't see straight, even this yes. It doesn't have to be these huge things. God wants our yes into everyday life. So I want to remind you about, is our front picture?
No.
I want to remind you when you're in that darkness, try to remember, it's so hard in the time, but maybe afterwards, when you're reflecting, encounter Jesus in that intimacy and in that darkness. He wants to love us. He loves us so much, and he wants us to love him so much. And part of loving him is loving his cross. And so he gives us our own crosses that are fit just for us. My cross is made just for me. No one else can carry it. And he wants us to embrace it and to love it. And to have hope that we carry this cross and then we get to spend eternity with him. So I just encourage you to lean your head on Jesus figuratively when I'm in a place, I close my eyes and I literally imagine myself leaning my head against Jesus' chest, and allow him to love us. All right, I think that's it.